Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Alan Miller sitting in, as usual, and we have a return guest, been with us once before, Stephen Blair Venable, and he uses his middle name because there are many Stephen Venables running around, so we have to distinguish him.
Surprisingly enough.
It's Stephen. Stephen was here, I guess, about a year ago.
That's right.
And didn't have that great tie on at that time, but
well, thank you.
I really like
I love this tie.
Man of many talents. He's a consultant, a management consultant. He is also a video personality here. And we did radio recently together. You have a regular radio that you do on WCCO.
I actually have a segment with Jordana Green every Friday night from 10 to 11. So it's called Just a Thought with Stephen Blair Venable.
And that's WCCO radio.
Absolutely.
But recently you stepped up into the big time because you sat in with me on the morning grind on AM 950.
Yes, I did. And I enjoyed every minute of it.
We had a lot of fun.
That's a fast pace.
Yeah. Morning radio is something that's really, you never know what you're going to get.
So you have to prepare for everything.
Just about.
Which apparently you had.
Now, Stephen wrote a book, copy of which is displayed here, and we'll get a close-up on it if Raven can do that, and I know he can. But this is a second edition, just came out.
It is indeed.
And the reason you put out a second edition is because you've gotten married since the first edition, and you wanted to show that on the cover of the book. No, that's not the reason.
That's terrible. Oh, actually, a couple of good studies came out.
The Commencement Odyssey.
Right, right. Wanted to add a little additional commentary about several subjects, but it had gotten a lot of good press and gotten me on Minnesota Public Radio and KARE 11 and the Fox Morning Show and all kinds of things. And as things happen, I think, why not update it?
So once again, and there it is, tell our viewers what the Commencement Odyssey is and what it purports to do.
Well, the Commencement Odyssey is essentially about two things. It's about the transition from college to the corporate workplace, which I think can be a rather perilous experience for kids. In the book, I talk about what I call the collegiate Renaissance values. And the idea there is essentially that there is really a set of values that we associate with an enlightened populace. It's the set of values that we try to instill in our children from the time that they're small. And if they haven't really, if those values haven't really taken hold by the time that they go to college, they come out of a 4-year college experience for those who are lucky enough to have it, and they're holding on to those pretty solidly. Things like question authority, be true to yourself, try to make the world a better place, seek meaning and value. And the problem that I talk about in the book, go ahead.
Don't those things come into direct conflict with what we have come to know as corporate values?
Yes,
they do. Corporate values are bottom line, how much money can we make, where can we outsource this, who can we take advantage of, money, money, money. And as we surge forward, that's got to be a shock for these young collegians.
It really is, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is this notion that with something being that important to someone's well-being after college, you'd think that someone would mention this as a part of post-secondary education. Because what happens to a lot of young people, certainly millennials, they go through college, they firmly embrace these values, and make no mistake, these are great values to have. And then at 200 miles per hour, they crash into the brick wall of the corporate paradigm. So you go into the corporate workplace, it's do not question authority, offer blind deference to your superiors, do what you're told, stay in a box, and if you want to make the world a better place, well, that's not a valid performance metric, so you might want to keep that to yourself. And that's a real problem. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I say in the book is I think that every post-secondary education should give students a chance to critically examine both the transition and these value conflicts before kids have the pressure of being in that environment. So when they're relaxed and they're in college, let's talk to them about what happens when they launch into the real world.
It's referred to really as culture shock, but I call it unculture shock.
Yes.
Because you learn the values, you learn the good things as you are an academic, as you are studying, as you're a student, and then you get thrust into this world, and just as you said, everything reverses.
I think that's right, and I think that if you pull back from that a little bit, you find sort of one of the great paradoxes of the civilized world, and that is that there is this disconnect between having a productive life, or in the United States, a financially successful life, on the one hand, and a good life. And for something to be that big and that basic, it's a wonder that no one, to my knowledge, has ever tried to unravel that paradox, starting with kids in college and their values, moving into the corporate workplace, and designing a business model that essentially allows a corporation to adopt and operate with the same set of enlightened values that a college kid would. That's what the Human Assets Organization is that I've designed.
And to me, if you don't learn to maintain the initial values that you had, you become one of the statistics who you find being prosecuted by a federal attorney.
Right.
And you lose yourself, your life values in this corporate milieu.
I think that's true. And I think, a couple of things happen. Some of the people go into the corporate workplace, and the big business, the traditional hierarchical corporate workplace, doesn't allow these enlightened young people to operate and work in a way that's consistent with their values. So some of them just crash. They aren't successful, they become sick, they're fired, they lose their confidence. And some other people just hang in there so long that they lose sight of the fact that the system that they're in needs to be changed. So their sensibilities and senses become deadened, and that's not a good thing either.
So those are the people who become Republicans and conservatives. You didn't say that.
I didn't say that. Well, one thing that I will say is, the corporate workplace, once again talking about the most traditional hierarchical workplace, it's got a very odd kind of Darwinism going on. People in big business would love for the population to believe, that the people who make it to the top make it there because they're the best and the brightest. But there's an analysis that hasn't been done, that should be done, and I do a little bit of this in the book, that sort of gets at what are actually the traits that are statistically correlated with getting to the top in the corporate workplace. And so, for example, if you look at a bunch of bright young MBAs who go into the workplace, of course the traditional corporate workplace is shaped like a pyramid. So it's sort of like a complex game of musical chairs. Every time the music stops, one seat is gone. And so you look at this class of people coming into the corporate workplace, and perhaps, they're all bright and they've got a good education, but one of the most important skills that one needs to have to get to the top is being able to get rid of one's competitors. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing, but that is a part of what happens. And so, once again, if you look at this class of people, and let's say, there's a normal distribution of personalities, the people who are really sensitive and kind and empathetic, they are worn down by the experience. The carnage and the inequity that they see, it makes them tired, it makes them stressed, it makes them sick, so they're less focused at
It
work.
also makes them victims.
It also makes them victims.
Victims of the other mentality,
Exactly.
which climbs on their back and then moves forward.
Exactly. And that's just my point. And I don't mean to be so extreme, but I'll be extreme, just for the purpose of making this point. If you take a person with a clinically antisocial personality, that person is not bothered by the inequity and the unfairness and the nonsense of politics and the human carnage that exists in the big traditional corporate workplace. So that person, is ready to go every morning. He or she hasn't lost any sleep. He or she is not distracted by what's going on. And that's a part of what happens as you watch the progression from the lower levels of the organization to the top. And that's a problem.
Have you seen a change in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of the mentality and the corporate workplace?
Well, yes and no. I think corporate CEOs right now are listening. And it isn't necessarily the case that they're listening because they're a different, better breed of people. Quite to the contrary, they're listening because we're now in this knowledge economy. If you go back to 1980 or so, and you look at S&P 500 companies, and you look for their market cap, their market value, only about 20% of their market value was based in human and intangible assets. So the way they derived their value, or at least the way they understood it, was about cash and equipment and inventory. You jump to 2009, and over 70% of the market cap of S&P 500 companies is made up of human and intangible assets. So what that means is the way you derive your value is based on your people. So now your people have become your greatest assets. So you have a CEO who is thinking about this, and that CEO also finds him or herself in the following situation with millennials. They're now the biggest generation. They control an awful lot of money. If you derive your value from the talent of your employees, then you need to recruit and retain the best people. Well, millennials, unlike any generation before them, they don't want to work for companies with no conscience. They don't want to work for unenlightened companies. They don't want to work for companies who aren't interested in making the world a better place. And then finally, as everyone knows, millennials will go onto social media and they will destroy your brand in a hurry, oftentimes for good reason.
The other side of the coin is I look at corporations 20, 30 years ago, and CEOs were all Caucasian.
Yes.
I look at them today, and there are some women who have risen to the top, but I don't see people of color necessarily in these corporations. So is there a racial inequality in all this?
Oh, absolutely. Corporate CEOs have not changed for a while. There are a few more people of color, and there are a few more women, but by and large, if you're talking about Fortune 500 companies, you're talking about white males, and you're also talking about white males who are supposed to be managed by the people in the corporate governance function, so that's the board. Generally speaking, they have relationships with these people, and corporate boards really haven't changed in 50, 60, 70 years. You're managed by people that you have a personal relationship with. They're inclined to approve your compensation package no matter how crazy it is. And so But there are things to be excited about. I think one of them is just that if you go back to 1970, when a lot of the craziness started with corporate raiders and junk bonds, and that was really, I think, the beginning of the period in which CEOs practiced shareholder capitalism rather than stakeholder capitalism. I mean, I was not born until 65, but my understanding is back in 1950 and 1960, when CEOs made decisions, they made decisions with the interests of all stakeholders in mind.
I don't
Stakeholders
see that
including the
today.
society.
I
You
don't see that today.
You don't.
I really don't. And that's very troublesome, because if that's the value that we're imbuing in these young people, it's a lot of trouble in the future. It's a lot of trouble down the road. I don't see, and we know statistically that middle class incomes, even if they remain the same, are then diminished because the cost of living is going up, inflation, even though it hasn't been really extreme. So the people in the middle are making less money
That's right.
than they did 10 years ago even.
Right. And to your point, and I mean, this gets at the interconnectedness of some of these issues. Certainly all of the presidential candidates are talking about or being forced to talk about social mobility. And that's another great issue of our time.
What a great segue that is
What a-
into
right.
what Jeb Bush said yesterday in New Hampshire. People, if they want to get ahead, are going to have to work longer hours and through their productivity gain more income for their families. This to me is absolutely ludicrous, because the fact of the matter is we are 25% more productive than we were in 2012 even.
Right.
And yet the people who are working more hours are not really benefiting their family. They're benefiting the top strata of
Right.
the corporation.
That comment by Jeb Bush is so utterly preposterous that I can only conclude that it's disingenuous. You know, any person with a high school education who reads the paper and thinks will know that that statement is not true. And I think part of the problem, Alan, is that in this country, and this is certainly true in England as well, so many of us are having difficulty starting at the ground floor of the analysis, which is we live in a class society. It's not a meritocracy. One of the things that I personally find very daunting is when we talk about improving rates of social mobility in this country, the first thing that most of us talk about is expanding access to post-secondary education. And I think that's right. I think that's a no-brainer. Here is what makes it a little bit more complex than one might think. If you look in England, and I think England and the United States are alike in many ways, this is a country that has been trying to improve rates of social mobility for 150 years. And so way back when they started trying to improve rates of social mobility, one of the things that they came up with was we should make access to post-secondary education universal. And they did that.
Which a lot of Europe has done.
Right.
And without cost, in
Right.
many cases, to the student.
Absolutely.
Just the opposite here. And we even have these online for-profit colleges,
Right.
many of which you've read about recently, that are going belly up,
Right.
and
And
really
many of them
robbing
should.
the students of
right.
the education they deserve. It's really frustrating to me. It's disappointing to me. And the question is there a way out of it? I mean, like with Jeb Bush, not only was that disingenuous, I think he's completely out of touch. This is a man who charges $50,000 for a 45-minute speaking engagement.
Right.
And I think he is totally out of touch with what most of the country is enduring.
I think that's right. And, you know, once again, to go back to the example of England, and the gentleman, I think the guy's name is Gregory Clark and Neil Cummins from one of the University of California schools in Queen College. they have done the seminal research on this. They have said that when you look at rates of transmission of intergenerational wealth in England, it hasn't changed going all the way back to the Victorian age. And so when you think about the last 150 years, all of these attempts, including expanding access to post-secondary education, hasn't changed rates of social mobility one iota. And I think that suggests to us that something a bit more fundamental is going to have to be done.
Well, Tom Brokaw at the end of World War II looked back and he called that the Greatest Generation. When I look at us today, I look at the Greediest Generation. What I see is people who have so much more than they possibly can ever use, who want yet more,
Right.
and more, and more.
Right.
This to me is so counterproductive, not only to a good society,
Right.
but to just having a matter of conscience. Now, one of the things you say in the book is that the typical corporate workplace is putting pressure on marriages and families. So explain why that is.
It's just a very difficult way to live. I mean, if you think about, so starting with the health of the populace. So right now, corporations in this country have essentially, I'd say approximately, between $200 and $300 billion a year in lost productivity due to the costs of stress in the workplace. And so you've got absenteeism, you've got what they call presenteeism, which is, you're there, but you're really not there. You've got workers' comp claims, and you've got the cost of health care. And so people are getting sick. And right now in the United States, this is 2015, up to 90% of all primary care visits, and this is of course adult visits, are for the treatment of stress-related illness. And research tells us that the American workplace is far and away the greatest cause of that illness. And so it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say to yourself, if you've got a man or a woman who's married or is in a relationship, you're in an absolutely toxic workplace, you may be managed by a clinically antisocial boss, you're working longer, you're working harder, you're playing politics and losing at the game. It's not a meritocracy, you're getting sick, of course it's going to affect your marriage.
And we see many countries who are really exceeding us in areas where America, the United States, used to be number one.
Yes.
And these are countries where people get 4 to 6 weeks vacation,
Right.
where they get as much as 6 months off for child care on the birth of a child,
Right.
where health care is paid for by the government, a single payer or something like that. All of these things are the things that you're saying factor in when the pressures then are counterproductive to families. They may even be destroying marital relationships or one-on-one relationships, not just marriage.
I think that's right. And to your point, in Scandinavia, and I believe it's Sweden, I don't think it's Norway, but I think it's Sweden, not only does the government support all of this leave, but they force both parties in the couple to take a certain amount of time or you lose it. So if you're a husband and you don't take your time, you can't give that time off to take care of a child to your wife. So it's not just taking care of the couple and taking care of the people, but it's driving gender equality. And that's a beautiful thing.
And what's going to be necessary in this country, because I don't see anybody grabbing onto this and saying, yes, that's the answer to restoring us to our prominence in the world. I don't see the mentality there.
Right. I'm a little bit more hopeful than that, and my personal opinion is that millennials are going to run a country mile with this thing. Because once again, if you're in a knowledge economy and you're deriving your value from the quality of your people, and the best and brightest people will not work for you, you're in a world of trouble. I mean, you know, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook famously said, and I hope I'm getting this quote right, that the best person at a company is better than, you know, the next 20 or 30 or 40 people. And so he has famously bought companies just to get the one or two best people. He said they're that valuable. So I think millennials, with their pristine Renaissance values and their desire to have a relationship with the workplace that is healthy and humane and makes sense, I think at some point there isn't going to be a way to avoid the change that's coming.
And a lot of that is in your book, which is published by Sergo. What does Sergo stand for, by the way?
Sergo is a Latin word that means to rise up. That's all it means, just to rise up.
See, you're running rings around us here. It's well, I guess you are more hopeful
I am.
than I am at the moment, because I don't see people taking the step that's necessary to
Right.
restore us to where we should be and to where we were for many years. I just see this greed permeating to such a degree that even well-intentioned young people are being turned
Right.
simply by gold.
Well, once again, I'm a little more optimistic than that. I think that there isn't a way to change people who have spent their lives chasing money. But those people are getting older. And when we made the transition from the old product-based economy to the knowledge or service economy, we're just seeing this huge influx of millennials. And I think, not to sound fatalistic, but part of what it's going to take is for some of these folks who are in the upper echelons of corporate America to retire or die off. And as they become more and more dependent upon millennials for their talent, millennials are going to demand power within the hierarchy. And I do think they'll change things. I really do.
Well, I can only hope that you're right. I just don't see a lot of evidence of it. And that's a far more hopeful view than what I've had for the last few years, because I just don't see it happening.
Right.
We've been talking with Blair, Venable, author, raconteur,
I love that word.
media host, and a publisher, management. I always wondered, what does a management consultant do? Probably says a lot of the things that you've said here.
Pretty much. Well, you know, so of course my original background is as a corporate lawyer.
And you've got about 20 seconds.
I've got 20 seconds, so let me make it short. I used to advise clients on corporate matters, and it easily turned into advising clients as a management consultant as opposed to a lawyer.
Blair, Venable, we thank you. Come back again.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Really.
Thank you.